The shield wall had broken. Bodies lay scattered across the frozen meadow like discarded offerings to gods who no longer watched. Smoke rose from burning longhouses in thick columns that merged with the gray winter sky, and the screams of the dying mingled with the victorious roars of the raiders. Blood turned the snow into a landscape of crimson and white. A brutal canvas that told the story of yet another village crushed beneath the ambitions of jarls who hungered for more land, more thralls, more glory. Among the carnage, a figure moved with terrible purpose. He was massive, easily a head taller than the tallest warrior, his shoulders broad enough that they seemed to block out the weak sunlight. His face was painted with streaks of ash and blood, his eyes wild with the remnants of battle fury. The bearskin cloak he wore was soaked through with gore, and the double-bladed axe in his hands dripped steadily onto the trampled earth. This was Bjorn Bloodaxe, the berserker who served Jarl Halvard, the man whose name was whispered in fear from the southern fjords to the northern forests. 23 winters had passed since his birth, but he had the reputation of a warrior twice his age. Men said the battle madness came upon him like a possession, that he fought with the strength of 10 men, that wounds that would fell others barely slowed him. They said he was blessed by Odin, cursed by Tyr, marked by the Norns for a violent destiny. He walked through the ruins of the village, his breathing still heavy, the last traces of the berserker rage ebbing from his blood like receding tide. His mind was returning, slowly, painfully. This was always the worst part. The moment when the red fog lifted and he could see clearly what his hands had wrought. The bodies at his feet, the burning homes, the widows clutching dead husbands. The silence that came after battle, heavier than any shield. A sound caught his attention, soft, almost imperceptible beneath the crackling of flames. Crying. He turned his head, tracking the noise with the instinct of a predator, and saw movement behind the collapsed wall of what had once been a storage house. His feet carried him forward before thought could intervene, axe raised, ready to finish whatever wounded warriors still drew breath. But when he rounded the debris, he stopped. It was a woman. Young. Perhaps 18 winters at most. Her dress was torn, face smudged with ash and tears, dark hair hanging loose and wild around her shoulders. She was backed against the wall, one arm cradling her ribs where some blow had landed, the other reaching behind her as if she could somehow push through solid wood and escape. Her eyes were wide with terror, fixed on his blood-covered form. On the axe that had ended so many lives that morning, she was shaking uncontrollably, and he could see she had injured her leg, a deep gash that bled freely onto her already ruined dress. There was no weapon near her, no sign she had fought. Just a survivor, caught in the wrong place when the raiders came. Bjorn stood there, axe raised, and felt something crack in his chest. It was not pity. Berserkers did not know pity in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, something that touched the part of him that still remembered being human before the first battle rage had claimed him. He saw his own sister in her face, though Astrid had been dead for 5 years now, killed by raiders not unlike the ones he rode with. He saw every woman who had ever looked at him with fear. Every mother who had pulled her children away when he passed through market squares. Every shield maiden who had refused his company because of what he was. The woman whimpered, pressing herself harder against the wall, and he realized she was praying. Not to the Christian god, this was still Norse land, but to Freya, goddess of mercy and fertility, begging for intervention that would not come. Her voice was barely a whisper, but he heard every word in the sudden stillness. She expected death. She had already accepted it. Her eyes were squeezed shut, waiting for the axe to fall. Instead, Bjorn lowered his weapon. The movement was slow, deliberate, and when she dared to open her eyes again, she found him watching her with an expression that might have been something like regret. He spoke, and his voice was rough from battle screaming, but the words were clear enough. He told her he did not kill women, not anymore. Not since he had watched his sister's body burn on a pyre, not since he had sworn an oath to whatever god still listened that he would not add to that particular tally of shame. It was a strange honor for a man who made his living in blood, but it was the one line he refused to cross. She stared at him, disbelief warring with desperate hope on her dirt-streaked face. He could see her mind working, trying to understand why this monster in human skin was offering mercy when none had been given to anyone else in her village. He did not explain further. Instead, he tore a strip from his own tunic relatively clean compared to the rest of his clothing and tossed it to her. He told her to bind her leg, to hide until nightfall, to flee north where Jarl Halvard's men would not pursue. The raid was over. The village was claimed. Survivors would be taken as thralls, but she was outside the settlement proper now. If she could move, she could escape. She caught the fabric with trembling hands, still watching him as if he might change his mind at any moment. He turned away before she could speak, before gratitude or curse could leave her lips. He had no stomach for either. His oath was his own business, his burden to carry, not something that required acknowledgement or praise. Behind him, he heard her scramble to obey, heard the hiss of pain as she wrapped her wounded leg. He did not look back. The other warriors were already gathering the spoils, rounding up the survivors, loading wagons with grain and livestock. Bjorn rejoined them, falling back into his role as if the moment in the ruins had never happened. Jarl Halvard's son, a cruel youth named Berserker, noticed his approach and laughed, commenting on the blood that painted Bjorn from head to toe. He asked how many the Berserker had claimed, and Bjorn gave a number that might have been accurate. He did not mention the woman behind the collapsed wall. Some kills were not worth claiming, and some mercies were meant to stay secret. They sailed back to Jarl Halvard's hall as victors, the longship heavy with plunder, the oars cutting through dark water in perfect rhythm. Bjorn sat near the stern, his axe across his knees, and felt nothing. The battle rage was gone completely now, leaving behind only the familiar emptiness. This was his existence, violence followed by void, fury followed by nothing. He was valued for his strength, feared for his madness, but trusted by no one. Men did not make friends with berserkers. They used them and kept their distance. That night, as the warriors feasted in the great hall and skalds sung of their victory, Bjorn took his portion of the spoils and retired to the small dwelling he maintained at the edge of the Jarl's property. It was little more than a single room with a sleeping platform and a fire pit, but it was his. Here, he could remove the bearskin and wash the blood from his skin. Here, he could be something other than Bjorn Bloodaxe, the berserker, the weapon. Here, he could remember the man he had been before the rage, before the reputation, before the first kill. He thought of the woman in the ruins, wondered if she had survived the night, if she had made it north to safety, or if exposure or wolves had claimed her anyway. It did not matter, he told himself. He had kept his oath. Whether she lived or died was in the hands of the Norns now, not his responsibility. But as he lay on his sleeping platform, staring at shadows dancing across the ceiling, he found her face lingering in his mind. The terror in her eyes. The prayer to Freya. The way she had looked at him when he lowered the axe, not with gratitude, but with something closer to confusion, as if mercy from a monster was an impossibility she could not reconcile. He closed his eyes and willed sleep to come, though he knew it would be restless. It always was after raids. The battle dead visited him in dreams, accusations in their silent stares. But tonight, he thought perhaps he would see a different face among them. A young woman with dark hair and terrified eyes. A woman who lived because he chose to let her. It was a small thing in a life full of violence, but it was something. perhaps the only thing he had left that made him feel even remotely human. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the room, and Bjorn drifted into uneasy sleep with the taste of ash still on his tongue and the weight of his oath resting heavier than any chain. The seasons turned with their usual indifference to human suffering. Spring thawed the frozen earth. Summer brought warmth and longer days for raiding. Autumn painted the forests in shades of dying fire. And winter came again with its harsh reminder that the gods demanded sacrifice simply to survive. Bjorn served Jarl Halvard through it all, riding to battle when called, shedding blood in the shield wall, returning to his solitary dwelling to wrestle with the emptiness that followed. His reputation grew darker with each passing year. Men crossed to the other side of the path when they saw him coming. Mothers used his name to frighten disobedient children. Even among the Jarl's warriors, who were no strangers to violence themselves. Bjorn stood apart, too dangerous to befriend, too valuable to exile. Jarl Halvard himself was a man in his 50th winter, gray-bearded and cunning, who had built his power through careful alliances and brutal enforcement. He valued Bjorn as a farmer valued a sharp scythe, useful for cutting down obstacles, but not something to grow attached to. The Jarl's son, Berserker, was being groomed to inherit both land and ambition, though the youth had more cruelty than wisdom, more pride than skill. Berserker particularly enjoyed tormenting those beneath his station, and he viewed Bjorn with a mixture of envy and revulsion. The Berserker's prowess in battle was undeniable, but Berserker could not stand that a man of such low birth commanded more fear than he did. It was during the second autumn after the raid on the woman's village that tensions within the Jarl's household began to surface. A neighboring Jarl named Ragnar had been encroaching on Halvard's territory, making bold claims about ancestral rights to certain fishing grounds and forest lands. Words were exchanged at the Autumn Thing, the great assembly where disputes were meant to be resolved through law rather than bloodshed. But laws meant nothing when pride was wounded, and both sides brought warriors who itched for conflict. The thing ended without resolution, and both Jarls returned to their halls knowing war was inevitable. Bjorn prepared for what was coming with the same detachment he brought to all conflicts. He sharpened his axe, mended his bearskin cloak, checked the leather straps on his shield. Other warriors boasted and drank, working themselves into a frenzy of anticipation, but Bjorn remained quiet. Violence was not something he celebrated. It was simply what he was made for, the only talent the gods had seen fit to grant him. When the Berserker rage took him, he fought with terrible efficiency, but there was no joy in it. Only the task, and then the emptiness after. The conflict with Jarl Ragnar began as these things always did, with small raids, burned farms, stolen livestock, testing each other's resolve, probing for weaknesses. Ragnar's men struck at outlying settlements, and Halvard's forces retaliated in kind. The violence escalated gradually, like water heating over a fire, until both sides were committed to a course that could only end in significant bloodshed. A proper battle was arranged, not through formal challenge, but through mutual understanding that the time for small strikes had passed. They would meet at a place called Ravenfield, a broad meadow flanked by forest, where the ground was level enough for proper shield walls. The night before the battle, Bjorn sat alone by his fire, methodically working oil into the leather grip of his axe handle. His mind was already beginning to turn inward, preparing for the transformation that would come. The Berserker rage was not something he controlled so much as something he surrendered to, a deliberate drowning, a willing possession. He would drink a mixture of herbs and fungi that the Volva, the Cirrus, prepared for those who fought in Odin's fury. The potion did not create the rage, but opened the door wider, made the descent faster and deeper. A knock on his door interrupted the ritual. Unusual. Fu sought him out by choice. He rose and opened it to find one of the jarl's huskarls, a grizzled warrior named Thorvald, who had fought in more battles than Bjorn had years. Thorvald's expression was grim as he delivered the message. Jarl Halvard wanted to see him, now, in the Great Hall. Bjorn followed without question, his bearskin cloak draped over his shoulders despite the warmth of the evening. The Great Hall was lit by torches and the central fire pit, casting dancing shadows across the carved wooden pillars and the shields that hung on the walls. Jarl Halvard sat in his high seat, Erikr at his right hand, several of the senior warriors arrayed around them. The Jarl's expression was unreadable, but Erikr wore a smirk that made Bjorn's jaw tighten. Halvard spoke plainly. Tomorrow's battle would be crucial, he said. Ragnar had more men, better equipment, and the advantage of fighting on ground he knew well. To ensure victory, Halvard needed his Berserker to do what he did best: break the enemy's shield wall, create chaos, spread fear. But there was more. The Jarl's scouts had identified Ragnar's position in the enemy formation. If Bjorn could reach the rival Jarl and kill him, the battle would end quickly. Ragnar's men would scatter without their leader. It was a suicide mission, Bjorn understood immediately. Reaching the enemy, Jarl meant carving through dozens of warriors, surviving concentrated spear thrusts and axe blows, fighting while surrounded on all sides. Even in Berserker rage, even with the gods' favor, the odds were impossible. He would die in that field. But that was why Halvard had chosen him. Berserkers were meant to die in battle. It was their purpose, their destiny. And Bjorn had no family to mourn him, no wife to become a widow, no children to lose a father. He agreed without hesitation. What else could he do? This was the bargain he had made when he first felt the rage take him his life in exchange for purpose, however dark. Jarl Halvard nodded, satisfied, and dismissed him. But as Bjorn turned to leave, Erika called out with barely concealed mockery. The Jarl's son wondered aloud if the great Berserker felt fear, if even Bjorn Bloodaxe trembled at the thought of tomorrow. The other warriors shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke against the heir. Bjorn stopped, his massive frame silhouetted against the firelight, and turned his head just enough that Erikr could see his profile. He told the youth that fear was for men who had something to lose, and walked out into the night without another word. Behind him, he heard Thorvald's low chuckle and Erikr's angry curse, but it meant nothing. Let the Jarl's whelp be offended. Tomorrow, Bjorn would do the dying, while Erikr watched from the safety of the rear ranks. He returned to his dwelling and drank the Volva's mixture, feeling it burn down his throat and settle like hot coals in his belly. The herbs began their work immediately, making his heart race, his vision sharpen, his muscles tense with barely contained energy. Sleep would be impossible now, so he sat by his fire and let his mind wander to strange places. He thought of Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where warriors feasted and fought for eternity. Would the Valkyries come for him tomorrow? Would he be deemed worthy to sit among the Einherjar? Or would his soul go to Helheim, the realm of the dishonored dead? He thought of his sister, Astrid, with her quick laugh and quicker temper, who had died defending their farm while he was away on his first raid. He thought of his parents, long dead from sickness, who had never lived to see what their son became. And, unexpectedly, unbidden, he thought of the woman in the ruins. 5 winters had passed since that day, and he had not thought of her in years. But tonight, with death waiting at dawn, her face returned to him, the terror in her eyes, the prayer to Freya, the confusion when he showed mercy. He wondered if she had survived, if she had found safety, if she ever thought about the blood-soaked monster who chose not to kill her. Probably not. She had likely fled as far from that memory as possible, built a new life, forgotten the horror of that day. That was how people survive trauma, by leaving it behind, by refusing to look back. Only men like Bjorn were forced to carry their violence with them everywhere, unable to escape what they were. Dawn came gray and cold. The warriors of Jarl Halvard assembled in the pre-dawn darkness, checking weapons and armor, speaking in low voices or not at all. Bjorn stood apart, as always, his axe resting against his shoulder, his bearskin cloak making him look even more like some creature from the old stories than a man. The other warriors gave him space, recognizing the signs, the dilated pupils, the barely restrained trembling. The way he seemed to look through rather than at things. The Berserker rage was building, held back only by force of will until the moment it would be needed. They marched to Ravenfield as the sun climbed sluggishly into the overcast sky. The enemy was already there, Ragnar's forces arrayed in a strong shield wall on the far side of the meadow, their banners bright against the dull landscape. Bjorn counted the men more than Halvard's scouts had reported, easily outnumbering their own forces by a third. Ragnar himself was visible at the center of his formation, a tall man in fine mail with a boar-crested helmet, surrounded by his best warriors. Getting to him would require a miracle or madness. Bjorn had only the latter to offer. Jarl Halvard gave the order, and the shield walls advanced toward each other across the bloodied grass of Ravenfield, where so many disputes had been settled in the old way, where the earth itself seemed to hunger for the violence about to be fed into it. And Bjorn felt the last threads of his humanity begin to fray as the Berserker rage rose up like a tide of fire in his blood. The shield walls crashed together with the sound of thunder made solid. Wood splintered against wood, metal rang against metal, and men screamed as spears found gaps in the wall and sank into flesh. The noise was overwhelming, a cacophony of battle cries, death rattles, weapons striking shields, commanders shouting orders that were lost in the chaos. The front lines heaved back and forth like waves breaking on rock, each side trying to gain even a foot of ground, each warrior pushing against the man in front of him while defending against the man opposite. Bjorn waited in the second rank, held back by Jarl Halvard's strategy until the moment was right. He could feel the rage building to unbearable levels, his vision narrowing, his breathing coming in harsh gasps. The mixture the Volva had given him was reaching its full potency, and every muscle in his body screamed to be unleashed. His hands gripped his axe so tightly the leather creaked, and he could taste copper in his mouth from where he had bitten his own cheek without noticing. Then Halvard gave the signal, and Bjorn was released like an arrow from a bow. He surged forward through the gap opened by his own men, and the Berserker rage finally broke free. The world turned red at the edges. Time seemed to slow and speed up simultaneously. He no longer thought, no longer felt pain or fear or anything except the overwhelming need to destroy whatever stood before him. His axe rose and fell in a rhythm older than words. The first man to face him raised his shield, but Bjorn's blow shattered both wood and the arm behind it. The second tried to duck, and the axe caught him across the shoulder, nearly severing the limb. The third managed to land a spear thrust that grazed Bjorn's ribs, but the Berserker did not even register the wound. He grabbed the spear shaft, yanked the warrior forward onto his axe blade, and pushed the dying man back into his companions. The enemy's shield wall buckled where Bjorn struck it. Warriors who had stood firm against the initial assault now broke and scattered, their discipline shattered by the sight of this howling beast in human form, who seemed immune to pain and tireless in his fury. He carved a path through their ranks like a ship's prow through waves, his bearskin cloak billowing behind him, his axe leaving a trail of the dead and dying. Jarl Ragnar's men tried to stop him. A group of huskarls, the Jarl's personal guard, formed a tight knot around their leader and braced for the Berserker's approach. These were veteran warriors, men who had survived dozens of battles, who knew their business and did not break easily. They met Bjorn with coordinated spear thrusts, trying to bring him down like hunters taking a bear. But the rage made him faster than should have been possible for a man his size, and the mixture in his blood dulled pain to distant noise. He took wounds, a spear through his left thigh, an axe blade that opened his shoulder to the bone, sword cuts across his arms and chest, but he did not fall. Each injury only seemed to fuel his fury further, as if pain itself was transformed into strength by whatever dark alchemy governed the Berserker rage. His axe swung in wide arcs, and warriors who had stood in formations for 20 years found themselves stumbling back, their shields shattered, their spears broken. One of Ragnar's huskarls, a gray-bearded man with cold eyes, managed to land a solid blow that cracked ribs beneath Bjorn's bare skin. The pain was white-hot even through the rage's dulling effect, but Bjorn's response was immediate and brutal. He drove forward, accepting another spear thrust to his side in order to close the distance, and brought his axe down in an overhead blow that split the veteran's skull like firewood. The body collapsed, and the man next to him hesitated, just for a moment, just a heartbeat. But it was enough. Bjorn was through the line of huskarls and face to face with Jarl Ragnar himself. The rival Jarl was no coward. He raised his own sword and shield and met the Berserker's charge with the courage of a man who knew his fate was sealed. Their weapons clashed once, twice, and on the third exchange, Bjorn's axe hooked over Ragnar's shield and yanked it aside. The sword thrust that followed would have killed most men, but Bjorn's left hand shot out and caught the blade, actually caught it, letting the edge cut deep into his palm as he held it immobile. His right hand swung the axe in a horizontal arc that ended in Ragnar's neck. The Jarl's death was not instant. He stumbled backward, hands clutching at the terrible wound, blood pouring between his fingers. His eyes were wide with shock and the beginning of understanding that his story ended here, in this field, killed by a berserker whose name he might not even have known. He fell to his knees, then forward onto his face and lay still. The effect on the enemy forces was immediate and catastrophic. Warriors who had been fighting with determination saw their jarl fall and felt the heart go out of the battle. Some continued to fight, driven by oaths or rage or simple survival instinct, but many broke and ran. The shield wall collapsed into scattered groups, then into individuals fleeing for their lives. And Jarl Halvard's men surged forward in pursuit, cutting down those who could not escape fast enough. Bjorn stood over Ragnar's body, his chest heaving, his entire frame shaking with residual fury and the aftershocks of the berserker rage. Blood, his own and others, covered him so completely that the bearskin was dyed a deeper shade of crimson. The axe in his right hand dripped steadily onto the trampled grass. His left hand, with the sword cut that went to the bone, should have been agony, but he barely felt it through the chemical haze still gripping his system. Around him, the battle was devolving into a rout. Halvard's warriors chased down fleeing enemies, and the field began to fill with the aftermath of violence, the wounded crying for help, the dying making peace with their gods, the crows already gathering in trees at the meadow's edge. Bjorn became aware of men giving him wide berth even as they celebrated victory, their triumph tempered by instinctive fear of the creature that had secured it for them. The rage was receding now, draining away like water through a sieve, and with it went the unnatural strength and pain resistance. Bjorn felt every wound simultaneously, felt the blood loss that was significant even by warrior standards. His vision swam, and he had to plant his axe in the ground to stay upright. Someone was calling his name, Avald maybe, or one of the other huskarls, but the words seemed to come from very far away. He tried to take a step and found his leg would not support his weight. The spear wound in his thigh had severed something important, and now that the rage no longer forced his body to ignore such damage, the leg simply refused to function. He went down on one knee, then both, and the world tilted in ways that suggested serious blood loss. He saw Jarl Halvard approaching, flanked by warriors. The Jarl's expression one of satisfaction at the victory, but concern at the state of his valuable weapon. Halvard was speaking, probably praising Bjorn's performance, possibly asking if he could be moved, but the Berserker heard none of it. His ears were ringing, his vision narrowing to a tunnel, and he could feel the pull of unconsciousness or death. He was not sure which, and found he did not particularly care. He had completed his task. Ragnar was dead. Halvard's victory was assured. Whether Bjorn survived to see another day was irrelevant in the larger scheme of things. He was a tool that had served its purpose. If the tool broke in the using, well, that was what tools did eventually. His last clear thought before darkness claimed him was that at least he would die as a berserker should in battle, covered in the blood of his enemies, having earned his place in Valhalla if the Valkyries deemed him worthy. Not a bad end for a man who had lived as he did. Better than growing old and weak, better than dying in bed like a woman or a coward. The old stories said that only warriors who fell in combat could enter Odin's hall, and Bjorn had certainly secured that right, if nothing else. The darkness rose up to swallow him, and he welcomed it like an old friend, letting go of consciousness without struggle, without regret, without hope or fear or any emotion at all except a distant, muted relief that the emptiness had finally claimed all of him, and there was nothing left to feel. Bjorn woke to pain that made the battle wounds seem merciful by comparison. Every nerve in his body screamed. His wounds felt like they were filled with broken glass. And even breathing was an exercise in agony that made him wish for unconsciousness again. He tried to move and immediately regretted it, a groan escaping his lips before he could suppress it. Weakness. He despised weakness, especially his own, but his body had been pushed far beyond reasonable limits even for a berserker. He was lying on his sleeping platform in his own dwelling, he realized slowly. How he had gotten there was a mystery his pain-fogged mind could not immediately solve. The last clear memory was Ravenfield, Ragnar's death, the sensation of falling as blood loss caught up with him. Someone must have carried him back, probably several someones, given his size, and deposited him here to either recover or die in private. That was usually how it went with wounded berserkers. They were too dangerous to keep in the main hall while they healed, too unpredictable, too likely to lash out at anyone who came near when pain and fever made them delirious. He turned his head with effort and saw that his wounds had been tended. Rough stitching held the worst of the cuts closed, and someone had packed the deeper wounds with moss and herbs to prevent rot. His left hand was wrapped so thoroughly he could not move the fingers, and he suspected the sword cut had done permanent damage to the tendons. His leg was splinted and bound. The spear wound cleaned and sealed with what smelled like pine tar. Professional work, probably done by Halvard's healer, a doer woman named Sigrid, who had patched up more warriors than she could count, and had the disposition of someone perpetually unimpressed by violence and its consequences. The door to his dwelling opened, and Bjorn tensed despite the agony it caused. His right hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that was not there, but it was only Thorvald, the grizzled Huskarl, carrying a bowl that steamed in the cool air. The older warrior saw Bjorn's defensive posture and shook his head with something that might have been amusement. Thorvald spoke as he set the bowl down within reach. Bjorn had been unconscious for 3 days, he said. The healer had wagered on his infection, blood loss, or simply the accumulated damage that no body could survive. But berserkers were stubborn about dying, Thorvald observed, and apparently Bjorn was more stubborn than most. The bowl contained broth, weak and thin, but nourishing. He should drink it if he wanted to keep healing rather than joining the Einherjar this season. The Huskarl provided other news as well. Jarl Halvard's victory was complete. Ragnar's remaining forces had scattered, his lands were being divided among Halvard's allies, and the rival Jarl's Hall had been burned to the ground. Arakor was already strutting around claiming credit for the strategy, though everyone who had actually fought knew it was Bjorn's assault that had broken the enemy. The Berserker's actions were already being turned into song by the Skald, exaggerated in the way of all such tales until fact and legend blurred together. But there were complications, Thorvald continued, his expression growing more serious. Bjorn had taken wounds that might never fully heal. The leg would probably never regain full strength, and the hand might be permanently crippled. For a farmer or a craftsman, such injuries would be manageable. For a berserker whose value lay entirely in his ability to fight, they were potentially career-ending. Jarl Halvard had not yet decided what to do with a weapon that might no longer function properly. The implication was clear enough. If Bjorn could not recover sufficiently to serve as he had before, he would become a burden rather than an asset. Halvard was not known for maintaining expensive warriors out of charity or sentiment. Berserkers who could no longer fight were typically given a sword, pointed toward the nearest border conflict, and encouraged to find a glorious death that would at least preserve their reputation. The alternative was exile or a slow decline into irrelevance, drinking away the pain in some forgotten corner of the Jarl's lands until death from infection or despair claimed them. Thorvald left the broth and departed without further comment, which Bjorn appreciated. The Huskarl was not the type for false comfort or meaningless reassurances, and Bjorn had no patience for either. He stared at the ceiling beams and contemplated his situation with the same detachment he brought to most things. His body was broken. His usefulness was questionable. His future was uncertain at best and non-existent at worst. He tried to lift his left hand and found he could barely move the fingers. Sigurd's stitching had saved the hand from amputation, but the tendons were damaged badly enough that fine control was gone, possibly forever. He could still grip with it, barely, but the strength and precision that had allowed him to catch swords and hold shields were diminished. His leg was no better. He could feel where the spear had cut through muscle, could sense that even if it healed, he would walk with a permanent limp. Running would be difficult. Fighting in a shield wall, where mobility was survival, might be impossible. The days that followed were a blur of pain and frustrated attempts at recovery. Bjorn pushed his body with the same ruthless discipline he had always applied, ignoring Sigurd's warnings about reopening wounds or causing permanent damage. He forced himself to stand despite the leg's protests, made himself grip things with his left hand until the stitches wept blood, spent hours working through the agony because pain was at least familiar and work gave him purpose when purpose was rapidly evaporating. But the body had its limits, and even Berserker's stubbornness could not overcome certain realities. His leg improved slowly, too slowly, and it became apparent the limp would indeed be permanent. His hand regained some function, but would never be what it was. And the other wounds, while healing, left him feeling diminished in ways he could not quite articulate. The reservoir of strength that had always seemed bottomless now had a visible floor. The recovery from exertion took longer. The next battle rage, whenever it came, would have to draw from a depleted well. Winter approached with its usual harsh inevitability. The settlement prepared for the lean, months-preserving food, reinforcing buildings, ensuring livestock would survive the cold. Bjorn participated as he could, his reduced capacity making him feel useless in ways that combat injuries never had. Other warriors recovered from Ravenfield and returned to training, their wounds mere badges of honor. But Bjorn's injuries were different, more fundamental, and everyone could see it even if no one spoke of it directly. Erikr, of course, had no such restraint. The Jarl's son made a point of visiting Bjorn's dwelling one gray afternoon, ostensibly to inquire about his recovery, but actually to deliver a message wrapped in false concern. Halvard was worried, Erikr said with transparent insincerity. The Berserker had served well, but the jarl needed warriors who could actually fight, not crippled relics trading on past reputation. Perhaps Bjorn should consider his options. There were always conflicts somewhere that needed expendable fighters, battles where even diminished warriors could find glorious deaths. It was dismissal, dressed as suggestion, exile phrased as opportunity. Bjorn recognized it for what it was and felt nothing in particular about it. He had always known this would be his end, eventually, used up and discarded when he could no longer serve his purpose. That it came sooner than expected due to injury rather than age was merely circumstance. The result was the same. He told Erikr he understood, his voice flat, and watched the jarl's son leave with poorly concealed satisfaction. That night, Bjorn sat by his fire and contemplated his future with the cold pragmatism of a man who had never expected to have one. He could leave now, before winter made travel impossible, and find some conflict to die in. That was the traditional Berserker's end battle until the body failed. Then one final glorious charge into overwhelming odds. Or he could stay the winter, try to regain more function, and face exile in spring when Halvard's patience finally expired. Or he could simply walk into the forest one frozen night and let the cold take him, though that path offered no honor, no Valhalla, nothing but oblivion. He was still weighing these options when his door opened without warning, and a woman entered. She was bundled against the cold. A thick cloak of wool wrapped around her frame, but when she pushed back, the hood Bjorn saw her face clearly in the firelight. Recognition came slowly, filtered through 5 years, and the haze of pain medication Sigrid had been giving him. Dark hair, though longer now and better kept. The same basic features, though matured, the roundness of youth replaced by sharper lines that suggested hard experience. And the eyes. No longer wide with terror, but calm and assessing, measuring him with the same careful attention he had given her when deciding whether to kill or spare. The woman from the ruins, the one he had not killed. She had returned. Bjorn's right hand moved toward his axe instinct training, but she made no threatening gesture. She simply stood there, snowflakes melting in her hair, studying him with an expression he could not read. Neither spoke for a long moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice low and steady, asking if he remembered her, as if he could forget. As if that moment had not been etched into his memory with the same permanence as his first kill, his sister's death, every other significant point in his violent existence. He told her he remembered. What he did not say was that her face had haunted him at odd moments over the past 5 years, appearing in dreams and half-conscious moments, a reminder of the one time he had chosen mercy over the easier path. What he did not ask was how she had found him, why she had come, what possible purpose could bring a woman back to the monster who had destroyed her village and stood over her with blood-soaked axe raised to kill. She answered some of those questions without being asked. Her name was Runa, she said. After that day, after she had fled north as he suggested, she had found work in a larger settlement as a weaver. She was skilled with her hands, had learned the trade from her mother before the raid, and the craft had kept her alive these past years. She had built a modest life, quiet and unremarkable, and tried not to think about the day her entire world had burned. But she had thought about him, the Berserker who spared her. It had made no sense then and made little sense now, but she had carried the memory like a splinter embedded too deep to remove. She had asked about him over the years carefully, in ways that would not draw attention, and learned his name, his reputation, the legends growing around Bjorn Bloodaxe. When word reached her settlement about the battle at Ravenfield and the Berserker's injuries, she had made a decision that even she could not fully explain. She had come to settle a debt, she said. He had given her life when he could have taken it. Now he was wounded, possibly dying, certainly abandoned by those who had used his strength. She knew something of healing more than just weaving. She had learned from a skilled woman in her new settlement, and she had herbs and knowledge that might help wear the jarls. Healer had reached the limits of her art. It was not charity, Runa emphasized. It was balance. She would not owe anyone, especially not a berserker with blood on his hands and a reputation for madness. Bjorn listened to this explanation with the skepticism of a man who had learned to trust nothing and no one. He asked why she would risk coming to a place where she might be recognized from the raid, where survivors might remember her village and wonder why she lived when so many died. He asked what she expected in return. Because no one offered help without wanting something, he asked, finally, what made her think he wanted her assistance? That he was not perfectly content to let his wounds heal or kill him as the gods saw fit. Runa's response was blunt. She had changed enough that recognition was unlikely. 5 years was a long time. And she had been nobody important in a village full of nobody important people. As for what she wanted, she had already said, balance. The settling of a debt, freedom from the weight of owing her life to a man she should by rights hate. And whether he wanted help or not was irrelevant. Because she was offering it and he was fool enough to probably refuse, which would solve the problem of her debt anyway when he died from stubbornness and infected wounds. It was perhaps the first time in years that someone had spoken to Bjorn as if he were simply a difficult man rather than a terrifying legend. The novelty of it, along with the recognition that she was probably right about his stubbornness hastening his death, made him agree. Or perhaps it was the exhaustion of pain, or the void where motivation used to be, or some half-remembered obligation to the mercy he had shown her once. Regardless of reason, he nodded his acceptance, and Runa set down the pack she had been carrying and began to unload supplies. What followed over the next weeks was a strange reversal of their first encounter. Then, he had held power over her life. Now, weakened and wounded. He was dependent on her care in ways that made him profoundly uncomfortable. She cleaned and redressed his wounds with a confidence that exceeded Sigrid's workmanlike approach, using different herbs and techniques she had learned. She made poultices that drew out infection, brewed teas that eased pain without dulling his mind the way Sigrid's mixtures did, and worked his damaged hand and leg through exercises that were agonizing but necessary. She was not gentle, exactly, but neither was she cruel. When he complained that she was making things worse, she told him bluntly that healing hurt and he should stop acting like a child. When he tried to dismiss her because pride demanded he suffer alone, she ignored him completely and continued her work. When fever from infection made him delirious and dangerous, she kept her distance, but stayed close enough to prevent him from reopening wounds in his thrashing. They spoke little during those first weeks. Runa was focused on her task, and Bjorn had never been inclined toward conversation. But gradually, as his condition stabilized and the immediate threat of death receded, they began to exchange words beyond the necessary. She asked about his life, and he gave answers that were honest in their bleakness. He asked about hers, and she described her existence with the same matter-of-fact tone, neither particularly happy nor miserable, simply surviving and finding small purposes in her weaving. Her friendships with other women in the settlement, the ordinary rhythms of peaceful life. It was clear she had no romantic interest in him, which was a relief. Bjorn had no capacity for such things, and the power imbalance of their situation would have made any attraction deeply problematic. She saw him as a problem to be solved, a debt to be cleared, and he saw her as what? Not quite an enemy anymore, but not quite anything else either. A complicated presence that forced him to remain alive when dying would have been simpler. One evening, as she worked pine salve into the scar tissue of his leg, She asked the question that must have been building since she arrived. Why had he spared her? Berserkers did not spare people. Warriors in the heat of raid did not show mercy. Men with his reputation did not suddenly develop conscience. So why? Bjorn had asked himself the same question many times over the years and never found an answer that satisfied. He told her what he had told no one else about his sister, about the oath he had sworn, about the one line he refused to cross, even as he crossed every other. He told her it was not mercy in any meaningful sense, just a strange quirk of honor that made no sense even to him. He told her she should not feel grateful, because the man who spared her had killed dozens of others that day, and the math of morality did not balance in his favor simply because one woman lived. Runa listened without judgment, her hands continuing their work on his damaged muscles. When he finished, she said that she had never felt grateful gratitude implied owing thanks, and you did not thank a man for not murdering you. But she had felt confused, and that confusion had stayed with her. And perhaps settling this debt was as much about resolving that confusion as anything else. She was not absolving him or forgiving him or declaring him redeemed. She was simply closing a ledger that had been left open too long. It was the most honest conversation Bjorn had experienced in years, possibly ever. No one spoke to berserkers with such directness, without fear or false reverence. Runa treated him like what he was, a broken man who had done terrible things and would probably do more if given the chance, but who was also just a person existing in the narrow space between one breath and the next. It was uncomfortable and oddly comforting in equal measure. As winter deepened and his healing progressed, Bjorn found himself capable of more movement. The limp was permanent, but he could walk unaided now. His hand regained enough function to grip, though the fine control was gone forever. He was still diminished from what he had been, still facing exile or expected death. But he was functional in ways he had not been when Runa arrived. That was something, though he could not decide if it was good or simply prolonging the inevitable. Erikr visited again, his displeasure evident when he saw Runa and recognized that the berserker was recovering rather than conveniently dying. The jarl's son made thinly veiled comments about harboring strangers, about berserkers who seemed less grateful than they should be for Halvard's past patronage, about the spring campaigns that were being planned and would certainly not include crippled warriors. Bjorn endured the visit with his usual silence, but after Erikr left, Runa observed that the youth had the look of someone who would find a blade in his back one day, and Bjorn found himself agreeing. Winter reached its coldest depths, the snow piling high, the nights seeming to last forever. Bjorn's dwelling was small but weather-tight, and Runa had taken to sleeping on a pallet near the fire, rather than making the dangerous journey back to wherever she was staying in the settlement. Nothing untoward occurred. They were long past any awkwardness about such arrangements, but it meant they were in constant proximity, which wore away at the careful distance both had tried to maintain. One night, when the wind howled like tortured spirits and the fire burned low, Runa asked what he would do when spring came. Bjorn had no answer. Stay and face eventual exile. Leave and find a death that at least had some dignity. Try to build something else from the ruins of what he had been. None of the options seemed particularly appealing, but then nothing in his life had ever been about appeal. It had been about surviving one day to reach the next, and if the days stopped having purpose, well, that was when most berserkers found their final battle. Runa listened, then said something that surprised him. She suggested he could come north with her. Not as anything in particular, not as a warrior or protector or companion, just as someone starting over in a place where Bjorn Bloodaxe was not known, where the reputation could be left behind like an old skin. It was not charity, she emphasized again. He had skills beyond violence. He knew how to build, how to work wood and metal, how to survive in harsh conditions. And she knew people who might value those skills more than his ability to kill. It was perhaps the most impossible thing anyone had ever suggested to him. Berserkers did not retire to peaceful lives. They did not learn new trades or join communities as ordinary members. They fought until they could not, and then they died. And that was the entire story from beginning to end. Suggesting anything else was like suggesting the sun might rise in a different direction or water might flow upward. It violated the fundamental nature of what he was. But he did not immediately refuse. And that was perhaps the most surprising thing of all. Winter's grip began to loosen as the season turned toward spring. Snow melted into streams that swelled the rivers, the days grew incrementally longer, and the settlement began to prepare for the active months ahead. Farmers made ready to plant, warriors checked weapons and armor for the raiding season. Merchants prepared goods for trade routes that would reopen once the mountain passes cleared. Life resumed its patterns, and those patterns included violence as naturally as they included harvest or festival. Jarl Halvard summoned Bjorn in early spring before the last snows had fully melted. The Berserker went to the Great Hall with Runa's warnings echoing in his mind. She had said that Jarl would force a decision, would not allow uncertainty to linger into campaign season. She was right, of course. Halvard was nothing if not practical about managing his resources, and a berserker who might not be able to fight was a resource whose status needed clarification. The Jarl received him in the same high seat where he had given the order that sent Bjorn to kill Ragnar. Erikr was present again, wearing the expression of someone anticipating entertainment. Several other senior warriors stood witness, their faces carefully neutral. This was not a private conversation, but a formal determination of Bjorn's future, and everyone present understood the implications. Halvard spoke without preamble. The Berserker had served well, he acknowledged. Ravenfield would be remembered as a great victory, and Bjorn's role in that victory was undeniable. But times changed, circumstances changed, and the Jarl needed to know whether his Berserker could still perform as required. The spring campaign was already being planned raids along the coast. Possibly a larger strike against a rival who had been making territorial claims. Could Bjorn fight in the shield wall? Could he enter the rage? Could he be the weapon Halvard had paid for all these years? The questions were fair, Bjorn had to admit. And the honest answer was that he did not know. He had not fought since Ravenfield, had not tested his damaged body against actual combat, had not attempted to invoke the Berserker rage with a system that might no longer support it. The herbs and fungi that triggered the transformation worked on a body's chemistry, and his body was fundamentally changed. The leg would slow him, the hand would weaken his weapon work. The accumulated damage might mean the rage simply burned him out faster, leaving him vulnerable and useless. He could have lied, could have claimed full recovery, agreed to join the spring campaign, taken his chances that he would either function well enough or die trying. But Bjorn had never been skilled at deception, and something about Runa's presence these past months had made him even less willing to pretend. So he told Halvard the truth. He did not know if he could still serve as before, but he doubted it. The wounds had been severe, the recovery incomplete. He was diminished, and honesty demanded acknowledging that fact. Erikr seized on the admission immediately, suggesting loudly that damaged goods should be discarded, that there was no honor in keeping warriors who admitted they could not fight. But Halvard silenced his son with a gesture and regarded Bjorn with an expression that might have been something like regret. The Jarl said that honesty was appreciated, rare as it was. But it left them with a problem. He could not keep a berserker who would not fight. It was not personal, merely practical. Resources had to serve their purpose, and warriors who could not war had no purpose in a jarl's household. What followed was the expected conclusion. Bjorn was released from service, effective immediately. He would keep what personal possessions he had, would not be pursued or marked as outlaw. but was expected to leave Halvard's lands within the month. There was no malice in the pronouncement, no satisfaction, just the cold arithmetic of leadership that measured everything in terms of utility and cost. Bjorn accepted the judgment with a nod, turned, and walked out of the great hall for what he knew would be the last time. Runa was waiting outside, bundled against the spring chill, and one look at his face told her everything. She asked what he would do, and he found himself without an immediate answer. The northern offer she had made still stood, she reminded him. Her settlement could use skilled workers, especially as building season approached. It would not be a warrior's life, would not offer glory or reputation, but it would be life rather than the alternatives he had been contemplating all winter. For the first time in his existence, Bjorn seriously considered a future that did not end in immediate violence. The idea felt wrong, felt like betrayal of everything he had been and done, felt like cowardice disguised as practicality. But it was also the only path forward that did not involve deliberately seeking death. And something in him, some stubborn cores that had survived the berserker rages and the wounds and the years of violence, resisted the idea of simply giving up. He told Runa he would think about it, which was more commitment than he had offered any plan for his future. She nodded, said she would be leaving in 3 days when the next trading caravan headed north, and that he was welcome to travel with her if he chose. No pressure, no expectations, just an open possibility. Then she returned to his dwelling to continue preparing for departure, leaving him standing in the mud and melting snow, contemplating futures that all seemed equally impossible. The next days passed in a strange suspension between endings and beginnings. Bjorn gathered his few possessions, weapons, clothing, tools, the handful of things that constituted his entire material existence. He said farewell to no one because there was no one to say farewell to. Thorvald found him once, offered a warrior's clasp of the forearm, and mentioned that berserkers who lived long enough to leave service were rare and perhaps fortunate in their own way. It was as close to encouragement as the grizzled huskarl would ever come, and Bjorn accepted it as such. On the morning of the third day, Runa finished her preparations and shouldered her pack. The trading caravan was assembling at the edge of the settlement. Merchants, a few families relocating, guards hired for protection on the journey north. Bjorn stood in the doorway of his dwelling, watching her prepare to leave, and felt the weight of decision pressing down with the force of a shield wall. He could stay, find some minor jarl who might value a diminished berserker enough to offer service, work his way toward an honorable death in some forgotten skirmish that would at least preserve his reputation. It was the expected path, the one that fit the story people told about warriors like him. Or he could go, step completely outside the narrative that had defined him, become something other than Bjorn Bloodaxe, live a life that had nothing to do with violence or legend or the gods' sport with mortal lives. It was the impossible path, the one that felt like admitting defeat, even as it offered something like actual future. Runa was at the edge of his property now, about to join the caravan. She glanced back once, not calling to him or beckoning, just acknowledging that the choice was his and hers was made. In that moment, Bjorn realized that she had already given him more than she had needed to, had healed him when he might have died, had offered possibility when he had expected only endings, had treated him like a person rather than a weapon or a monster. The debt she spoke of was long since balanced, if it had ever existed. She owed him nothing. But she stayed anyway, which meant something even if Bjorn could not articulate exactly what. He moved before conscious decision had fully formed. Grabbed his axe because some things you did not leave behind even if you never intended to use them again. The pack that contained everything else he owned, limped out of the dwelling that had been his home, such as it was, and started toward the caravan. Each step was a small violence against the story he had been living. each meter a betrayal of the reputation he had built. Each choice to keep walking a rejection of the easier paths that led to glory and death and the song the skald would have sung. Runa saw him coming and waited, her expression carefully neutral, giving him space to change his mind until the last moment. But Bjorn kept walking until he reached her side, and then they turned together toward the caravan and the north and whatever waited in places where names like Bjorn Bloodaxe meant nothing at all. The settlement at his back, the life he had known receding with every step, and ahead only uncertainty and the slim possibility that damaged things might be rebuilt into something else. Something that served purposes beyond bleeding and breaking. The journey north would take weeks, following old trade routes through forests and along rivers, through lands where different jarls held power and different conflicts simmered. It would be dangerous in its own way, bandits, wild animals, treacherous terrain, but it was a different kind of danger than Bjorn had spent his life confronting. This was the danger of travel and misfortune, not the danger of men trying to kill him, because that was what warriors did. It felt strange and uncomfortable and entirely foreign to everything he knew. But Runa walked beside him with the confidence of someone who had survived worse than a difficult journey, and the other travelers in the caravan gave them the wide berth that strangers always received, but nothing more hostile than that. No one knew who he was. No one feared him or valued him or expected him to be anything except another traveler heading north for whatever reasons travelers had. It was anonymity in a way Bjorn had never experienced, and it was both liberating and deeply unsettling. As the settlement disappeared behind a bend in the road and the forest closed in around them, Bjorn allowed himself one last look back. Somewhere in those buildings, Jarl Halvard was planning his spring campaign. Erika was probably already spreading stories about the Berserker who left rather than face battle diminished. The skald might compose a verse about it, or might not bother because failed warriors did not make good songs. The world Bjorn had known would continue without him, barely noticing his absence. And that was perhaps the greatest revelation of all, that a man could dedicate everything to violence and reputation and death-seeking glory. And it would matter so little that his disappearance left hardly a ripple. He turned forward again, adjusting the weight of his pack, feeling his damaged leg already protesting the journey ahead, and walked into whatever came next with no idea if it would be better or worse than what he left behind, knowing only that it would be different, and that perhaps different was enough of a reason to keep walking when every other reason had been stripped away. The journey north took longer than Runa had estimated. Spring rains turned roads to mud that slowed the caravan, swollen rivers forced detours that added days to the route, and twice they had to shelter from storms that turned the world into sheets of water and winds that threatened to tear the trees from the ground. The traveling party huddled under makeshift shelters, miserable and cold, while thunder rolled across the sky like the gods themselves were fighting above them. Bjorn found the journey exhausting in ways that combat had never been. Battle was intense, but brief hours of terror and fury followed by either death or recovery. This was grinding persistence, day after day of pushing forward despite discomfort, despite pain, despite the constant low-level stress of travel through uncertain territory. His leg ached constantly from the unaccustomed exercise, and by evening he could barely walk the final meters to wherever they made camp. Runa noticed, but said nothing, which he appreciated. She simply ensured he had food and access to the fire, treating him no differently than any other member of the traveling group. The other travelers gradually grew accustomed to his presence. The merchants, who had been wary at first of the huge scarred man with the ever-present axe, relaxed when Bjorn proved to be quiet and useful, helping with heavy loads, assisting when wagons became stuck in mud, standing watch without complaint during his assigned shifts. The families traveling north gave him more space. But he noticed the children sometimes watching him with the fearless curiosity unique to the young. He had no idea how to interact with children, and avoided them when possible, but their lack of terror was novel enough to be noteworthy. About 2 weeks into the journey, they passed through lands where rumors of conflict were fresh. A raiding party had struck a settlement nearby, though whether it was Halvard's men or some other jarl's forces was unclear. The caravan encountered refugees heading south, families who had lost homes and sought safety in larger settlements where jarls maintained better defenses. The refugees had the hollow-eyed look of people who had survived trauma, and Bjorn found himself avoiding their gazes, knowing he had created that exact expression on countless faces over the years. One evening, while the caravan was camped near a stream, a group of armed men appeared from the forest. There were 6 of them, clearly not legitimate warriors, but bandits who preyed on travelers. They were not particularly skilled, probably farmers turned desperate by hard seasons, or former warriors dismissed for incompetence. That they had weapons and numbers and the confidence that came from targeting merchants rather than soldiers. Their leader, a man missing several teeth and sporting poorly healed sword scars, demanded tribute for safe passage through what he claimed was his territory. The caravan guards, 3 hired swords of middling ability, tensed but did not immediately draw weapons. The situation balanced on the edge of violence, everyone waiting to see who would commit first. Bjorn felt the old familiar tightening in his chest, the way his body prepared for combat even before his mind had fully processed the threat. His hand moved toward his axe, instinct and years of training taking over. But Runa's hand on his arm stopped him, her touch light but deliberate. She stepped forward instead, addressing the bandit leader with remarkable calm for someone facing armed robbers. She negotiated, pointed out that the caravan had little of value worth dying over, that the guards might be outnumbered but would certainly take at least half the bandits with them if fighting started. The dead bandits could not spend whatever they stole. She offered a modest payment, enough to satisfy honor but not enough to encourage future ambush sand. Suggested that everyone could walk away intact if egos and blades stayed sheathed. The bandit leader considered this, looked at his men, looked at the caravan guards who were clearly hoping to avoid conflict, and looked finally at Bjorn. The Berserker had not moved since Runa stopped him, but there was something in his stance, in the way he watched them, that made the bandit pause. Here was a man who was not afraid, who looked at 6 armed opponents with the same expression someone might give a minor inconvenience. The bandit leader was experienced enough to recognize the difference between merchants playing at courage and someone who had nothing left to fear from violence. He accepted Runa's offer. The payment was made, the bandits melted back into the forest, and the caravan exhaled collectively. The merchants praised Runa's negotiation skills, the guards looked relieved they had not needed to fight, and the families huddled closer to the fire as if proximity to flame could ward off future threats. Bjorn said nothing, but later, when they had privacy, he asked Runa why she had stopped him. Her answer was simple. 6 bandits would not have been a challenge for Bjorn Bloodaxe the Berserker, she said. But for Bjorn, the man traveling north to start over, killing 6 people, however justified, would have been a problem. Batas attracted attention, violence attracted questions, and they were trying to leave that life behind, not carry it forward. Besides, she added with something that might have been humor, his leg was barely holding together after 2 weeks of walking. Fighting 6 men would have definitely reopened wounds she had worked hard to heal. It was pragmatic reasoning that Bjorn could not argue with, though some part of him, the part that had lived for violence so long, felt diminished by not responding to threat with force. But that part was what he was trying to leave behind, if such a thing was even possible. So he accepted her logic and continued north, and tried not to think about how easy it would have been to return to what he knew, how simple to let the old instincts take over, and solve problems the only way he had ever learned. The journey continued through lands that grew progressively less familiar. The forests changed character, different trees, different undergrowth, different sounds from birds and animals. The settlements they passed through had different customs, slight variations in how homes were built and fields arranged. Nothing dramatic, but enough to reinforce that he was moving beyond the world he knew into territory where his reputation and his past had no weight. Finally, after 4 weeks of travel, they crested a hill, and Runa pointed to the valley below. That was her settlement, a collection of buildings along a river. Smoke rising from forge and hearth, fields being prepared for planting, the organized chaos of a working community going about its business. It was larger than Bjorn had expected, but still modest by the standards of earldoms to the south. Perhaps 200 people, maybe less, enough to sustain itself, but not so large as to attract the attention of ambitious rulers. The caravan dissolved as they reached the settlement, merchants heading to trading posts, families to whatever relatives or arrangements they had made, guards to the nearest alehouse to spend their pay. Runa led Bjorn through the settlement, drawing curious looks but no outright hostility, to a small building on the outskirts that served as both her home and workshop. Looms stood against one wall, bundles of wool and finished cloth stacked neatly. Tools of her trade arranged with the precision of someone who took pride in their craft. She had prepared for his arrival, he realized. A second sleeping platform had been built, simple but functional, with furs and blankets already laid out. A workspace with tools for woodworking and basic smithing sat ready. She had assumed he would come, had made arrangements. And the presumption should have annoyed him, but instead felt like the first genuine welcome he had received in longer than he could remember. That evening, Runa introduced him to some of the settlement's residents. There was Thorstein, the elder who served as the closest thing to a leader in this place without jarls. There was Astrid. The name made Bjorn flinch, so close to his dead sisters who ran the settlement's small forge and worked iron with skill that would have impressed any warrior. There was Gunnar, who managed the communal fields and had the tired look of someone who dealt with the eternal challenge of making Earth produce enough to feed everyone. They regarded Bjorn with cautious interest. Runa had told them something of his history, enough that they understood he had been a warrior, not so much that they knew the full extent of what Bjorn Bloodaxe had done. They asked what skills he had beyond fighting, and he listed what he could building: basic smithing, woodworking, survival skills honed by years of campaign living. They nodded thoughtfully and said they would find uses for such talents as building season approached. The conversation was remarkably ordinary, touching on crop yields and trade agreements, and whose roof needed repair, the mundane concerns of people whose lives revolved around creation rather than destruction. Bjorn contributed little, still adjusting to the idea that such concerns could be his concerns, that he might participate in conversations about harvest and construction rather than strategy and combat. It felt surreal, like watching someone else's life from a distance. Over the following weeks, Bjorn began to integrate into the settlement's rhythms. He worked with Astrid at the forge, learning to make tools rather than weapons, finding that the skills translated but the purpose felt entirely foreign. He assisted with construction, his strength still useful even if diminished, and learned that building things gave a strange satisfaction that destroying them never had. He spoke little, preferring work to words, but the settlement's residents gradually accepted his presence as normal rather than threatening. His leg remained a constant issue. The injury had healed as well as it would, but the permanent limp meant certain tasks were difficult or impossible. He could not run, could not maintain balance on uneven ground without care, could not move with the speed that had once been his advantage in combat. It was frustrating and humbling in equal measure, a daily reminder that the body he had relied on was fundamentally changed. Runa watched his adjustment with the same practical assessment she brought to everything. She pointed out improvements when she saw them, did not coddle him when he struggled, and maintained the same straightforward honesty that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. They were not friends exactly. The power dynamics of their history precluded easy friendship, but they had developed something like mutual respect, an understanding that they were both survivors trying to build something from damaged foundations. Summer approached, bringing warmth and longer days. The settlement prepared for the season's work planting was complete. Now came the maintenance and watching and hoping that weather and fortune would allow for good harvests. Bjorn found himself falling into routines that were completely foreign to his previous existence. Morning work at the forge, or in construction. Midday meal with others, listening to conversations about ordinary concerns. Afternoon continuation of whatever project needed attention. Evening by the fire, exhausted from labor that did not involve violence. It should have been peaceful. Should have felt like the new beginning Runa had suggested was possible. But Bjorn found himself struggling with the absence of the life he had known. The battle rage that had defined him for so long was dormant but not gone, lurking in his blood like a sleeping beast that might wake at any provocation. The violence he had committed haunted him more in peaceful moments than it ever had between battles, as if removing the constant distraction of survival allowed guilt and memory to surface. He had nightmares regularly, vivid dreams where he relived raids and battles, where the faces of the dead accused him. There he woke, gasping and sweating to find Runa watching from her sleeping platform with concern she did not voice. He discovered that living with what he had done was harder than doing it had been, that the emptiness that followed battle was easier to bear than the fullness of consciousness and peace. One night, after a particularly brutal nightmare had woken him screaming something that had not happened since he first became a berserker, he sat by the dying fire and contemplated returning south. Not to Halvard, but to find some conflict where a damaged warrior could still find purpose in violence, where he could stop trying to be something he was not and accept what he had always been. It would be easier than this, simpler than wrestling with questions of redemption and change that had no clear answers. Runa found him there in the pre-dawn darkness, recognized the look on his face, and sat down across the fire. She did not ask what he was thinking. They were past that kind of careful dancing around difficult topics. She simply said that no one expected him to transform overnight from warrior to craftsman, from berserker to peaceful citizen. The fact that he was trying was enough, even if trying was painful and success uncertain. She added that she still had nightmares about the day her village burned. Still sometimes woke in terror, thinking she was back in those ruins with an axe-wielding monster standing over her. The trauma did not vanish simply because time passed or circumstances changed, but she had chosen to keep living despite the nightmares, had chosen to build something from the wreckage, and that choice had to be renewed every day, even when it would be easier to give up. It was perhaps the most personal thing she had shared with him, an acknowledgement that her own survival was an active struggle rather than a settled fact. Bjorn found it oddly comforting, not because her pain made him feel better, but because it suggested that difficulty and adaptation was normal, rather than a personal failing unique to him. As dawn broke and the settlement began to wake around them, Bjorn made a decision that was less dramatic than choosing to come north, but equally significant. He would stay. Not forever. Not with any promise that it would work, or that he would successfully become something other than what he had been. For now, for today, for however many days he could manage before the weight became unbearable. He would stay and keep trying, and if he eventually failed and returned to violence, at least he would know he had attempted the alternative. Runa nodded as if this was exactly what she had expected, rose, and began preparing for the day ahead. Bjorn followed her lead. standing with the familiar ache in his leg and the less familiar ache in his chest, where something like hope was trying to establish itself against all reasonable odds. The settlement came alive around them, people emerging to start their work, children running between buildings. The ordinary miracle of a community that existed without constant threat of violence. And Bjorn, for the first time in his life, tried to imagine himself as part of that rather than as the violence that threatened it. 5 years passed in the northern settlement, and Bjorn found that time moved differently when it was not measured in battles and raids. The seasons cycled with their familiar pattern, but instead of marking campaign years and winter recovery, they marked planting and harvest, building and repair. The endless small efforts that sustained communities built on creation rather than conquest. It was not the life he had imagined, because he had never imagined any life beyond the next fight, but it became something like existence. His body continued its adjustment to work that demanded endurance rather than explosive violence. The forge became his primary domain, working alongside Astrid to produce tools and hardware the settlement needed. His damaged hand limited fine detail work, but he could manage the heavy hammer swings and rough shaping that formed the foundation of smithing. The heat and repetition of forge work provided a kind of meditation, a focus that quieted the battle memories that still surfaced unexpectedly. The leg never fully healed, the limp a permanent feature that marked him as obviously damaged. Children in the settlement knew him as the big man who walked funny and worked at the forge, not as Bjorn Bloodaxe the Berserker. He preferred it that way. The reputation he had built in blood held no value here, and he found liberation in anonymity even as it felt like betrayal of everything he had been. Runa continued her weaving, her work gaining reputation in the wider region for quality and artistry. Traders came specifically to purchase her cloth, and the income helped sustain both her workshop and the household they shared in the practical but undefined way that marked their relationship. They were not married. Neither desired that complication, but they lived as something more than acquaintances and less than lovers, bound by shared history and mutual benefit rather than romance or passion. They spoke more as the years passed. Though neither was naturally talkative, Runa shared stories of her life before the raid, the family she lost, the skills her mother taught her that became her survival. Bjorn found himself recounting pieces of his past as well, not the violence itself, but the edges around it. The strange moments between battles, the few people he had known who seemed more than targets or allies of convenience. It was not healing exactly, but it was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement was a step beyond the silence he had maintained for most of his life. The settlement itself grew slowly, new families arriving as word spread of land available and work to be found. Thorstein aged visibly, his leadership passing gradually to younger members who had energy for the endless negotiations and decisions that running even a modest community required. Astrid took a husband, a farmer named Eric, who had steady hands and a steadier temperament. And their household expanded with children that filled the settlement with noise and optimism about futures that extended beyond immediate survival. Bjorn watched these developments with the detachment of someone who had never expected to witness ordinary happiness. He was not unhappy, and happiness required caring about states of being, and he remained mostly numb to such concerns. But neither was he happy in any recognizable sense. He existed, worked, ate, slept, and rose to repeat the cycle, and if that lacked the intensity of his previous life, it also lacked the emptiness that had followed every battle rage. The nightmares diminished over time, though they never fully disappeared. He still woke occasionally with the taste of blood in his mouth and his hand reaching for an axe that was not beside his sleeping platform. But the episodes grew less frequent, less intense, and he learned to manage them without the panic that had characterized the early years. Runa had been right that adaptation was possible, though she had not promised it would be complete or comfortable. In the 4th year, a group of warriors passed through the settlement legitimate Herkman, serving a jarl whose name Bjorn did not recognize, traveling to some conflict in the north. They stopped for supplies and rest, and Bjorn kept his distance. But one of the older warriors recognized him despite the years and changes. The man had been a young fighter when Bjorn was at his peak, had witnessed Ravenfield, and he approached the forge with the mix of reverence and curiosity that legends inspired. He asked if the rumors were true, if Bjorn Bloodaxe had really abandoned warfare for smithing, if the Berserker who had killed Jarl Ragnar now made horseshoes and door hinges. There was no mockery in the questions, just genuine interest in how such a transformation was possible. Bjorn confirmed the basic facts without elaboration. And the young warrior, no longer young, Bjorn realized, everyone aged while he was not paying attention, awed slowly. The warrior said that songs were still sung about Ravenfield, that Bjorn's reputation had actually grown in absence, tallies of his battles becoming more elaborate with each telling. He had become myth rather than man, which suited Bjorn fine, since the man was who he was trying to be now, and the myth could stay in the south where it belonged. The warriors' group moved on after a day, carrying with them confirmation that Bjorn Bloodaxe lived but was no longer the figure from the stories. And Bjorn found himself hoping that news would spread and the legend would finally be allowed to die. The 5th year brought unexpected crises. A sickness swept through the settlement in late autumn, killing several elders and weakening many others. The healer, an older woman named Diorin who knew herbs and remedies but not enough to combat this particular illness, worked herself to exhaustion trying to save people. Runa fell sick as well, and for several terrible days. Bjorn thought the debt and balance and whatever they had built together would end with her burning on a funeral pyre. He sat by her side through the worst of the fever, doing the things Duran instructed, keeping her cool, making her drink even when she was barely conscious, changing the furs when they became sweat-soaked. It was the first time in his life he had cared for someone who was ill, and he discovered it required a different kind of courage than facing warriors in a shield wall. There was no enemy to fight, no way to use strength or rage to solve the problem. Just helpless watching and hoping, and the terrible wait to see if she would recover or slip away. She survived, though it took weeks for her to regain full strength. During her recovery, as he continued to work the forge and manage the household tasks she normally handled, Bjorn realized with something like surprise that he would have been genuinely devastated by her death. Not because of the practical complications it would create, but because Runa had become important to him in ways he had not consciously acknowledged. Not love, he was not sure he was capable of that emotion, but something adjacent to it, a connection that went beyond utility or obligation. When she was finally well enough for real conversation, he told her this clumsily, without romance or eloquence, just stating the fact that her potential death had affected him more than he expected. She looked at him with an expression that might have been affection and said that she would try not to die unexpectedly, which was about as close to sentiment as either of them was comfortable with. They continued as they had before, but something had shifted imperceptibly. An acknowledgement that what they shared had weight and value beyond the original debt that brought them together. The settlement recovered from this sickness slowly, mourning its dead and adjusting to the gaps left in the community fabric. Bjorn found himself more integrated than before, no longer just the scarred stranger who worked the forge, but someone who had stayed through crisis and contributed to survival. It was not acceptance exactly. His past ensured he would always be somewhat apart, but it was inclusion of a sort he had never experienced. As the 5th winter approached, Bjorn stood one evening outside the forge, watching smoke rise from the settlement's hearths into the darkening sky. His leg ached with the cold, as it always did, and his damaged hand had the stiffness that came with dropping temperatures. He was 47 winters old, which was ancient by warrior standards, but merely middle-aged for someone living a less violent existence. He had survived longer than any berserker he had known, and the survival felt simultaneously like victory and like cheating some essential accounting. He thought about the man he had been, Bjorn Bloodaxe, the feared berserker, the weapon that jarls aimed at their enemies. That man was dead in every way that mattered, killed not by battle, but by the slow attrition of peaceful years and the decision to keep choosing something other than violence. He thought about the woman in the ruins who he had spared, who became Runa the Weaver, who saved him in turn not once, but continuously through her presence and practicality. The debt between them was so tangled and balanced now that accounting was meaningless. He thought about Ravenfield, the battle that should have been his death, the wounds that became the excuse to attempt transformation. About Jarl Halvit and Erika, who probably never thought of him anymore, who were pursuing their own ambitions and conflicts in the south, where men like Bjorn were still valuable for what they could destroy. About his sister Astrid, dead 25 years now, whose memory had driven the oath that saved Runa, and thus, indirectly, saved him. The door to the forge opened, and Runa emerged wrapped in a heavy cloak, her breath visible in the cold air. She stood beside him without speaking, both of them watching the settlement prepare for night, the ordinary miracle of people finishing daily tasks and retiring to warmth, and whatever safety could be found in community. Finally, she asked what he was thinking about, and he found that for once he had an answer. He was thinking that he had expected his story to end at Ravenfield, that everything since had felt like an epilogue to a tale that should have concluded with glory and death, and perhaps a verse in some skald's song. But epilogues could be longer than the main narrative, he realized, could contain their own significance, even if that significance was quieter and less suited to epic poetry. He was thinking that he had become someone his younger self would not recognize and would probably despise, and that this was perhaps the closest thing to redemption someone like him could achieve. Runa nodded as if this made perfect sense, and said that she had expected her story to end in those ruins, crushed beneath a berserker's axe or enslaved by raiders, erased as thoroughly as her village. Instead, she had built a life that her family would have approved of, found skills and community and purpose that extended beyond mere survival. She was thinking that neither of their stories ended where they should have, and that perhaps this was how survival actually worked, not dramatic reversals, but slow accumulation of days that added up to something like a life. They stood together as full night descended and the settlement grew quiet. Two damaged people who had found something like peace, not through transformation or redemption, but through the simple stubbornness of continuing to exist past the point where their stories should have ended. The cold deepened, winter approaching with its usual certainty, and they turned together toward the warmth of the building they shared, leaving behind the darkness and the memories and the ghosts of who they had been, walking into whatever remained of lives that had been given a second act through chance and choice and the complicated mathematics of debt and gratitude and mercy shown and returned. The forge fire would need banking for the night, and there was food to prepare, and tomorrow would bring its own tasks and challenges and small victories. Bjorn Bloodaxe was dead, had been dead for 5 years, and would stay dead. But Bjorn the smith, the survivor, the man still learning what it meant to be something other than a weapon, he continued, one limping step at a time, into a future that held no glory, but also no longer demanded he pay for existence in blood. It was enough. Perhaps it was more than enough. Perhaps it was the only victory that had ever really mattered, the victory of still being alive to wonder whether victory mattered at all.